I want to welcome all of you. Tיאור from our foreign ministry. Yaron, thank you for all your work to make this happen. It's interesting that the one ambassador here is from the Czech Republic. Says something. They were our greatest friends in the most difficult days. Israel fought its 1948 War of Independence with Czech rifles. But the relationship is not just a relationship between Czech and Israel, it's between the Czech people and the Jewish people. It says something about your friendship, which is reciprocated, and we will never forget it. We're going to talk about something we don't forget today, but I want to thank you for taking the time to be here today. This is a very important episode to remember, simply because so many people have forgotten it. Now, I think there are two reasons why they forgot it. The first reason, frankly, is because of the Holocaust. Because it is such a seismic event in the history of our people that it sort of blocked everything else out. It blocked out not only other tragedies that were happening at the same time, but it also blocked out Jewish tragedies that go by centuries. Something I've spoken about in the past, how people don't even remember anti-Semitic acts that claimed attacks against Jews. It claimed tens of thousands and sometimes hundreds of thousands of lives because Hitler and the Holocaust has sort of been the great sun that blocks all the anti-Semitic stars out of the sky and makes it difficult to see. The second reason is, of course, the Jewish refugees were settled. Most of them, the vast majority of them, in Israel. And they were settled not without difficulties. Maybe someone will speak about that later. And those difficulties still exist today. They actually affect Israel's political and social life to this day, 70 years later. But they were integrated into our country. They become leading members of Israeli society, those refugees who came from those lands, in every field. In politics, we've had a president, we've had a Speaker of Knesset, not yet a Prime Minister, but a President and Speaker of Knesset. In military, we've had multiple chiefs of staff whose families came as refugees to Israel. In the legal field, we've had Supreme Court justices. In business and medicine and culture, you name it, they have integrated into our life in Israel. And because they've integrated, because they haven't been left to rot in refugee camps, or not even to rot, just to not have a permanent home in refugee camps, they were never used as a political tool in global or regional politics. That's why a lot of people have forgotten this story. But we must remember it. And we must remember it, if we're going to remember what we lost, I should say, we have to remember what we had. What was this great world that was destroyed in 1 year, 2 years, 3 years? What was there? Well, the story of the Jews of these lands, actually, it ended with a tragedy, but it began in tragedy. The Jews were crying on the rivers of Babylon. The original Jews who moved to these lands moved after the destruction of the first temple by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. And they went over it, and you can read all about the story in a book. It's available in most hotel rooms, in America. You can read all about the story of the Jews going to Babylon. And remember, that's 1,000 years before the rise of Islam. 1,000 years before the Arab conquest of the Middle East. And from the beginning, the Jews flourished in Babylon. And how do we know that? We know that because when the Jews had the opportunity to return and rebuild their temple under Cyrus, very, very few did. It wasn't bad on the other side of that river. Ezra came back in Nehemiah, and they actually list in the Bible exactly how many people came back, and it was a very, very small percentage of the Jews who returned because they had a thriving Jewish life in Babylon, and that Jewish life thrived for centuries. In fact, there was a battle between the Jews of Babylon and the Jews of Israel over primacy. And in those first centuries, even though the community was a wealthy and prominent community in Babylon, and many of the Jewish leaders stayed in Babylon, there was still something unique about being in the land of Israel. But there was this constant battle between, this was the original diaspora Jewry, which was in Babylon, and Israel. But that changed after the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70, and after the revolt of Bar Kokhba. The center of Jewish life actually shifted and went to Babylon. Now, how do you know that? You know that because there were two Talmuds. One is the Jerusalem Talmud, and one is the Babylonian Talmud. Now, the Jerusalem Talmud actually came earlier, in 350. And the Babylonian Talmud was in the year 550. But we don't study, very, very few people actually study the Jerusalem Talmud. But everybody studies the Babylonian Talmud because that was the center of Jewish learning for centuries. And great yeshivas, Surah and Pumbedita, and a dominant age of what is called the Gaonim. Everyone knows today about the Vilna Gaon. That's sort of before Einstein. For a century and a half, all the Jewish parents were telling their kids, I want you to be another Vilna Gaon. Well, there was Sadia Gaon, 800 years before. The greatest minds and the greatest thinkers were there in Babylon for 1,000, 1,500 years. It's a remarkable legacy. But Jewish life was not just in Babylonia. It spread all throughout the Middle East and North Africa. It was in Egypt, particularly in Alexandria, which was a thriving, great Jewish community that also competed with Israel at the time of the Second Temple, the time of the Greeks, a couple centuries before, when the story of Hanukkah takes place. There's a very strong and thriving community. You can read all about that in the book of Maccabees in Alexandria. And you had in Libya and Tunisia during the time of the Romans as well, a very prominent trading Jewish community. Morocco, particularly after the Muslim conquest. And of course, Yemen. There's probably people here who've read the letters that Maimonides writes 800 years ago to the Jewish communities of Yemen. So these were communities that were there for centuries. Until the 10th century, this may be hard for people to understand or to believe. Until the 10th century, 90% of Jews in the world lived in what is today called the Arab states, the Arab world. 90% of the Jews until the 10th century. And until the 17th century, more Jews lived in those lands than lived in Europe. And at the turn of the previous century, at the turn of the 20th century, there were nearly 1 million Jews. 1 million Jews who lived in these lands. In 1939, 1/3 of Baghdad was Jewish. 1/3. That's a higher percentage than the Jews of Warsaw, and Warsaw was seen as a Jewish city, and a higher percentage than the Jews of New York City, which was also seen as a Jewish city. There was a thriving culture. You had leaders in every field. This was a very prominent, substantive community that could trace its origins in these states back further than almost any peoples who lived with them and among them. And then in a matter of a few years, in the late 40s and early 50s, a massive expulsion occurred. 250,000 in Morocco, more than 100,000 in Algeria, Iraq, and Tunisia, more than 50,000 in Egypt and Yemen, more than 25,000 in Libya, Turkey, and Iran, and the list goes on and on. 850,000 in all. And that's shocking for such a short amount of time. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't anti-Semitism before in the Muslim world. There was, but it's important to remember that if you were I'd say Jews were better off for most of our history, when you had both Islam and Christianity as faiths, living in the Muslim world than they were living in the Christian world. That's changed in the 21st, 20th, and the 21st century. But in the 12th century, if you were a Jew and you could choose between living in Christian Germany or Muslim Spain, you would have definitely chosen Muslim Spain. And in the 15th century, if you could choose between living in Christian Spain or Muslim Turkey, you would have chosen to live in Turkey. And in the 17th century, if you could choose between living in Poland or Persia, you would have definitely chosen Persia. That is not to say that the Jews were not second-class citizens. We were dhimmis. We were, by definition, we were second-class citizens. And there were periodic outbreaks of violence. In the 11th century, 6,000 Jews were killed in a single day in Fez, Morocco. Of course, people with a love of history, or knowledge of history, I should say, will know that a great blood libel that occurred in Damascus in 1840. So this is before the rise of Zionism. You would have periodic outbreaks of violence, less than in the Christian world, but they were there. So it would not have been surprising as Israel was being established that there would be also anti-Semitic attacks. That would not come as a surprise. There was a history of occasional anti-Semitic attacks, and you saw it as the state of Israel was having its birth pains. It's the contractions for the state. The Farhud in Baghdad that killed 179 people and injured over 2,000. That's 1941. In Tripoli, 1945, 140 Jews killed in a pogrom. And in Yemen, in 1947, 80 killed. But what's unique about this is that this was a massive and deliberate and systematic expulsion of Jews. Now, I want to read you from a text that a lot of people don't know about that was actually written 70 years ago, right in these days, after the UN resolution of November 29, 1947, before the end of the year. Here's what it says. Let me see if I can read it without my glasses. I don't think so. All Jewish citizens, this is a text of a law drafted by the Political Committee of the Arab League. Okay? Political Committee of the Arab League. All Jewish citizens of, state the name of the country, will be considered as members of the Jewish minority state of Palestine and will have to register with the authorities of the region wherein they reside, giving their names, their exact number of members in their families, their addresses, the names of their banks, and the amounts of their deposits in these banks. This formality is to be accomplished within 7 days. Bank accounts of Jews will be frozen. These funds will be utilized in part or in full to finance the movement of resistance to Zionist ambitions in Palestine. Only Jews who are subjects of foreign countries will be considered as neutrals. These will be compelled either to return to their countries with a minimum of delay or be considered as Arabs and obliged to accept active service with the Arab army. Jews who accept active service in Arab armies or place themselves at the disposal of those armies will be considered as Arabs. Every Jew whose activities reveal that he is an active Zionist will be considered as a political prisoner and will be interned in places specifically designated for that purpose, will be interned in places specifically designated for that purpose by police authorities or by the government. His financial resources, instead of being frozen, will be confiscated. Okay? This is in black and white, a text by the Arab League in 1947 that was adopted by Iraq, by Egypt, by other Arab states. So it's important to remember what happened. Because in 1947-48, with the birth of Israel, 2 refugee problems were created. What these refugee problems have in common is that they both were caused by the Arabs, specifically by the Arab rejection to accept a Jewish state. There were many differences, and not least among those differences is there were more Jewish refugees than Palestinian refugees. About 850,000 Jewish refugees, about 600,000 Palestinian refugees. The bigger difference and the important difference and the moral difference is that the Arabs had a deliberate policy of expelling the Jews. I just read you what they said and they put on paper to send out to other states to have them sign on to. They had a deliberate and systematic policy of expulsion. Israel did not have a policy of expulsion. We can get into all the facts of what happened in 47, 48, but here's a simple one for anyone who believes in that nonsense. Over 160,000 Arabs stayed in Israel. Today, they're over 1.7 million. They decided to stay. The vast majority of Palestinians who left Israel during the 1947-48 War of Independence never saw a single Israeli soldier. Something around 70% of them never saw it. And I know that because I have a very good first-hand witness to it, which was my mother, who was sitting in her village in Gedera watching 5 Arab villages around her all leave, not a single Israeli soldier or officer, tank, nothing in sight. They left. They said the Arab states are going to come in, they're going to destroy the Jewish yishuv, and then they were going to come back. And one person, I wrote a column about this many years ago, one person was nice enough to say to my grandmother that they were going to come take her house. So over 70% never even saw a soldier. But what happened in the Arab world is that this was a deliberate policy. I said there were 160,000 Arabs in Israel. They decided to stay. They were welcome to stay. Today there's 1.7 million because they stayed. The Jews in the Arab world, I said at the turn of the previous century, there were 1 million strong. Today there are 4,000. That is why tonight we should recommit ourselves to bringing justice to the refugees. But the ones who deserve justice most are the ones who are mentioned least, the Jewish refugees from the Arab world. So thank you for joining us to remember them tonight. Rest assured, Israel has not and will not forget them. Thank you.